Welcome to True Crime Case Files, where we dive deep into the chilling mysteries and shocking truths behind crimes. Today we unravel a twisted tale of betrayal, deception, and murder set in Diamond Springs, California. In early June of 2019, this is the story of a woman whose life ended in a gruesome act of violence after exposing her husband's shocking affair with a gold digger. Janet Hughes was 44 years old at the time of her tragic death in early June of 2019. She lived in Diamond Springs, California, a small, tight-knit town known for its gold mining history and quiet neighborhoods. Janet was the founder and director of Hope Haven, a group home for abandoned children with disabilities. Her work was widely admired, and she was even featured in a local news story by the Sacramento Bee just months before her murder. Janet was praised as a hero for her tireless dedication to children who had nowhere else to go. Janet's personality was a mix of kindness and determination. Friends described her as fiercely protective of the children in her care. She often worked long hours, sometimes until midnight, ensuring every child received the medical care and education they needed. Yet, those who knew her more closely noted she had a strong need for control. She kept detailed schedules for everything, and was known to micromanage her staff. Janet's high standards and meticulous ways earned her respect, but also created tension in her personal relationships. Before moving to Diamond Springs, Janet grew up in Fresno, California. She earned her degree in social work from California State University, Sacramento, where she was a standout student and an active member of the college's debate team. After graduating, she began working for child welfare services, quickly rising through the ranks thanks to her work ethic and innovative ideas. Janet's home reflected her personality. It was spotless, with every room decorated in soft pastels and filled with neatly organized bookshelves. In her living room stood a locked glass cabinet displaying her rare collection of porcelain dolls. Each doll had a unique name and represented a child who had once lived at Hope Haven. Janet's friends sometimes found the collection eerie, but she explained that it was her way of remembering each child's story. In the weeks leading up to her death, Janet seemed more stressed than usual. Hope Haven had recently launched a new community outreach program, and Janet's workload had increased. She told her close friend and ex-lover Susan Clark that she was exhausted but excited about the program's potential to help more children. "I'm making a difference," she told this friend during a coffee break at the local Starbucks. "That's all that matters." Janet's last known public appearance was at the Diamond Springs annual Founders Day Parade, where she marched alongside some of the children from Hope Haven, waving to the crowd with her usual warm smile. Janet's lifeless body was discovered on June 10, 2019, in the backyard of her home on Oak Ridge Lane. The peaceful neighborhood was rocked by the news of her death. Around 7:30 a.m., one of Janet's neighbors, 85-year-old Doris Lane, noticed something unusual while walking her dog, Buddy James Prestovitz. Doris saw that Janet's back door was wide open and became concerned. She called out for Janet, but received no response. When she stepped closer, she saw Janet lying face down near the garden shed. Panicked, Doris immediately called 911. Within minutes, officers from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. The area was quickly taped off, and investigators began their work. The crime scene was disturbing. Janet was wearing the same clothes she had on the evening before: black slacks and a light blue blouse. There were visible bruises on her arms and neck, suggesting she had been in a struggle. A broken flower pot and scattered gardening tools nearby hinted at the chaos that had unfolded. Detectives found no immediate signs of forced entry into Janet's home, but several drawers inside were open, and the contents appeared to be rifled through. Janet's smartphone was missing, along with a small wooden jewelry box she kept on her dresser. However, her wallet containing cash and credit cards was untouched. These inconsistencies made investigators question whether the scene had been staged. Later that day, Janet's close friend and colleague, Susan Clark, arrived at the scene after hearing the news. She was visibly shaken, describing Janet as someone who always put others first. She didn't have enemies. Everyone loved her, Susan told reporters from the Sacramento Bee. The autopsy report, released a few days later, confirmed that Janet had been strangled. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had fought back. This detail further solidified the belief that Janet's death was not a random act of violence, but a targeted attack. As word spread through Diamond Springs, residents were left in shock and fear. Vigils were held at Hope Haven, where children and staff gathered to remember Janet. A small memorial of flowers and candles grew outside her home. The tragedy left the community desperate for answers as law enforcement ramped up their investigation. Detectives Aaron Givens and Paul Mendoza arrived at the Hughes residence just before noon on June 10, 2019. Both seasoned investigators, they were immediately struck by the chaotic scene inside the home. The kitchen, where Janet Hughes's body had been found, bore clear signs of a violent struggle. Broken glass littered the floor, furniture was overturned, and a Ginsu knife lay on the countertop, its blade stained with blood. One detail that stood out to investigators was the presence of gold flakes near Janet's body. The flakes were small but unusual enough to warrant closer examination. Detectives speculated that they might have come from a piece of jewelry or an object handled during the struggle. This clue, though puzzling at first, would later prove to be a key piece of evidence. Forensic teams meticulously combed the scene, collecting fingerprints, examining blood spatter patterns, and cataloging items that appeared out of place. Janet's body showed multiple stab wounds, and defensive injuries on her hands suggested she had fought desperately for her life. The brutality of the attack led detectives to believe the crime was deeply personal. Despite the gruesome nature of the scene, there were no signs of forced entry. This raised immediate questions about whether Janet knew her attacker. Inside the home, several drawers were open, their contents disturbed, but items like her wallet and a tablet remained untouched. Detectives quickly ruled out robbery as the primary motive. Neighbors were questioned throughout the day. Doris Lane, the neighbor who had discovered Janet's body, described seeing a red Jeep parked near the house the previous evening. She remembered the vehicle because it seemed out of place in their quiet neighborhood. Detectives also learned that Janet had recently reported suspicious emails and phone calls to a close friend, further pointing to premeditation. The investigation's early focus turned to Janet's husband, Victor, given the often documented statistic that in many cases of domestic homicide, a spouse is involved. However, the gold flakes found at the scene suggested another angle, one that would unravel a much more complicated narrative. As news of Janet's death spread, the small town of Diamond Springs grappled with both grief and unease. Few could imagine what would come next as detectives pieced together the truth behind the shocking crime. Victor Hughes, 47, was Janet's husband of 15 years and a well-known local author specializing in sexy historical romance fiction, otherwise known as bodice busters. Victor's reserved demeanor often contrasted with Janet's strong-willed personality, leading to occasional tension in their marriage. He spent most of his time at home, working on manuscripts or researching at the Diamond Springs Public Library. His recent book, Her Breasts Were the Gold Rush, had gained modest acclaim among erotic fiction enthusiasts. Investigators zeroed in on Victor early in the case, as statistics frequently point to spouses in cases of domestic homicide. When questioned, Victor admitted that his relationship with Janet had grown strained over the years. He described her as controlling and admitted to feeling overshadowed by her success with Hope Haven. Despite this, he adamantly denied any involvement in her death, claiming he had spent the evening of June 9 grading essays for a part-time job he held at a local community college. However, Victor's alibi quickly began to unravel. Detectives found his fingerprints on the knife block in the kitchen, raising questions about his activities on the night of the murder. Although Victor claimed he had cooked dinner earlier and inadvertently touched the knives, the explanation failed to account for the smudges of what appeared to be blood found on the handle of one knife. Forensic analysis later confirmed it matched Janet's DNA. Neighbors also reported hearing raised voices coming from the Hughes home the night before Janet's body was discovered. This led investigators to believe there had been an argument. Doris Lane, the neighbor who had found Janet's body, recalled seeing Victor's car parked in the driveway late into the evening, further complicating his claims of a peaceful night spent working. Victor's interrogation raised additional red flags. While he remained composed throughout questioning, his answers were often vague or evasive. Detective Aaron Givens noted his calm demeanor was unsettling given the circumstances. When confronted with inconsistencies, Victor grew defensive, stating, "I bleeping loved my wife. Whatever problems in the bedroom we had, I would never hurt her." Despite the mounting evidence against Victor, the investigation was far from conclusive. Detectives knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to make an arrest. Meanwhile, the revelations about Janet's secret life and the discovery of gold flakes at the crime scene pointed to the possibility of another suspect with an equally compelling motive. Melody Berg, 25, was a confident, ambitious woman. She worked as an operations manager for her family's gold mine, a role that earned her respect in Diamond Springs. Melody was known for her boldness and unapologetic attitude. She was also well connected in the town and was never afraid to go after what she wanted. One of her targets was Victor Hughes, Janet's husband. Despite his being married, Melody had no qualms about pursuing him. Victor had always seemed aloof and introverted, but that didn't stop Melody from trying to win his affection. She had been seen with him in public, and local gossip suggested that their relationship had grown beyond professional. Melody often wore a gold nugget necklace, a gift from Victor, which she proudly displayed. She drove a red Jeep, a vehicle that stood out in the small town. People who knew her described her as calculating and fiercely determined to get her way. When the police began investigating, they found that Melody had a potential motive. Investigators learned that Melody was aware of Janet's controlling nature and her abusive treatment of Victor. Some of Janet's friends revealed that Melody had openly said Janet was the only thing standing in the way of her future with Victor. On the night of Janet's murder, Melody claimed she had been at the gold mine, inspecting equipment. However, security footage from a nearby convenience store showed her red Jeep parked just 2 blocks from the Hughes home around the time of the murder. This raised questions. When police brought her in for questioning, Melody remained calm, answering all their questions but displaying little emotion. She said she had no reason to harm Janet and was shocked to hear about the murder. Despite her composed demeanor, the evidence started stacking up against her. Investigators learned that Melody had a significant amount of resentment toward Janet for keeping Victor under her thumb, and her infatuation with him had become an obsession. They believed this obsession could have played a major role in the murder. It seemed Melody had much to gain by removing Janet from the picture. As the investigation into Janet Hughes' murder unfolded, attention turned to her business partner, Susan Clark, a 39-year-old former financial advisor. Susan had co-founded Hope Haven with Janet 3 years earlier. The women had bonded over their shared passion for aiding women escaping domestic violence, something that briefly flowered into an illicit sexual relationship. But their professional relationship had reportedly soured in recent months. Witnesses described Susan as sharp and driven, but also volatile under pressure. Former employees recounted tense disagreements between Susan and Janet over the direction of the organization. Janet had pushed for expanding services, including opening a second shelter, while Susan was more conservative, arguing that Hope Haven's finances could not support such ambitions. These disputes grew heated, with one staff member recalling a particularly loud argument in May 2019 that ended with Susan storming out of a board meeting. Detectives also uncovered financial irregularities in Hope Haven's accounts. A forensic audit revealed a series of unauthorized withdrawals totaling nearly $25,000 over the preceding year. The money had been funneled into a personal account linked to Susan. When questioned, Susan initially claimed the funds were legitimate reimbursements for expenses she had covered out of pocket. However, her explanations didn't align with the audit's findings. Adding to the suspicion, Susan had reportedly been seen near the Hughes home on the night of June 9. A local Domino's pizza delivery driver, who was making rounds in the neighborhood, remembered spotting Susan's blue Subaru Outback parked a few houses down from the Hughes residence around 8:30 p.m. When asked about her whereabouts that evening, Susan told investigators she had been at home watching reruns of The Great British Bake Off on Netflix. However, she was unable to provide any corroboration for this alibi. Forensic evidence further complicated Susan's situation. A pair of gardening gloves found in the trunk of her car tested positive for trace amounts of Janet's blood. When confronted with this evidence, Susan appeared flustered, claiming she had no idea how the blood got there and insisting she had nothing to do with the murder. Despite these discoveries, Susan maintained her innocence, repeatedly stating, "Janet was my friend and partner. I would never hurt her." While her motives, both financial and personal, seemed plausible, detectives faced the same challenges with Victor. The lack of direct evidence tying Susan to the crime. With 2 viable suspects and no definitive answers, the case remained a complex puzzle. On the afternoon of June 7, 2019, investigators uncovered a shocking twist in the case. The police had been carefully combing through Janet's personal records and emails in the days following her death. They were looking for anything that might explain her violent end, something to point to a clear motive. The breakthrough came when one of the officers discovered a trail of emails between Janet and a man named Chi Bung-hong, a retired Malaysian businessman. At first, the emails seemed innocuous, but as they dug deeper, the investigators realized that these exchanges were far more sinister. Janet had been secretly running an illegal operation involving the sale of healthy white children to wealthy families in Asia. The families there viewed these children as symbols of good fortune. This information sent shockwaves through the investigation. Janet, who had built her public persona around running Hope Haven, a home for abandoned disabled children, was actually using the donations and support of the community to fund this illegal child-selling operation. The children with disabilities she kept at Hope Haven to maintain the illusion of her altruistic work. Janet's vast network included a well-known businessman, Chi, who was deeply involved in the child trafficking scheme. The police immediately began questioning Chi, but his whereabouts were unclear. He had been in the country on a temporary visa and was frequently traveling between California and Malaysia. His connection to the child-selling ring seemed to explain the substantial private income Janet had kept secret. Investigators now had a clearer picture of Janet's double life. She wasn't just a dedicated worker at Hope Haven. She was a criminal mastermind, exploiting the very children she claimed to be helping. The twist also provided more insight into Melody's actions. The discovery of Janet's illegal dealings with Chi explained why Melody was so enraged when she found out. The woman she had once seen as an obstacle was, in reality, a cruel manipulator who had been profiting off children's suffering. Melody's motives had become much clearer. Chi Bung-hong, 75, was a retired businessman with a dark past. He was born and raised in Malaysia, and after making his fortune in international trade, he became a powerful and influential figure. Chi was also Janet's secret partner in her child trafficking operation. Though he kept a low profile, Chi was known for his charisma and cunning, qualities that had helped him build his business empire. Despite his age, he remained sharp, but he had also developed an addiction to cocaine, which made him unpredictable. Police later found that he frequently carried a silver flask filled with an opium-infused liquor, which fueled his erratic behavior. His addiction led to violent outbursts, which made some of those around him fear his wrath. When investigators began looking into his connection to Janet's operations, they learned that Chi was more than just a business partner. He had once been Janet's lover, although that relationship had ended long before her death. The discovery of his involvement in the child-selling ring shocked the investigators. But what was even more troubling was his possible involvement in Janet's murder. Chi was interviewed several times by the police, but his responses were vague and inconsistent. At first, he denied any knowledge of Janet's dealings, claiming that their relationship had ended amicably. However, evidence began to mount against him. Investigators found his fingerprints on some of Janet's documents, and witnesses reported seeing him in the area around the time of the murder. Despite the mounting evidence, Chi's advanced age and health issues made it difficult for the police to act swiftly. He was an expert at manipulating situations to his advantage, and it wasn't clear whether he had actually played a direct role in Janet's murder, or if he was merely complicit in her illegal activities. Nonetheless, his involvement in the child trafficking scheme made him an important figure in the investigation. The day after the investigators discovered the shocking details of Janet's illegal operation, they began to focus their attention on the person who had the most to gain from her death, Melody Berg. The evidence against her had been mounting, and now, with the discovery of Janet's involvement in the child-selling ring, Melody's anger and frustration became much more understandable. The police had already linked Melody to the crime scene through her fingerprints on the murder weapon, a Ginsu knife, and the blood spatter on her distinctive gold nugget necklace. She had been at the Hughes home the night of the murder, and her vehicle had been seen nearby. Melody had also been overheard claiming that Janet was an obstacle to her future with Victor. In the interrogation room, Melody was calm, but it didn't take long for her to break under pressure. When confronted with the new evidence, she finally admitted to the crime. Melody confessed to the murder in a fit of rage, explaining that she had discovered Janet's child trafficking operation and couldn't stand the thought of her exploitation of vulnerable children. Melody also revealed that she had confronted Janet, and their argument escalated into violence. In the heat of the moment, Melody stabbed Janet 79 times with a knife. The brutal nature of the murder shocked the investigators, but Melody's confession made it clear that her actions were motivated by a desire to protect Victor from Janet's manipulation. The final act of gouging out Janet's eyes was a symbolic gesture, a twisted form of justice in Melody's eyes. The arrest of Melody Berg shocked the small town of Diamond Springs. For those who had known her, it was hard to believe that the confident, ambitious woman they had trusted could commit such a violent act. But for Melody, the crime seemed to be the culmination of years of resentment and manipulation. Melody Berg's trial began in early 2020, and it quickly became the talk of Diamond Springs. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Clara Thompson, 44, argued that Melody's actions were premeditated. Thompson was known for her tough stance on crime and her ability to secure convictions in even the most challenging cases. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Melody had a clear motive. Her obsession with Victor, combined with her outrage over Janet's illegal child-selling operation. Thompson highlighted the brutality of the murder, particularly the 79 stab wounds and the gouging of Janet's eyes. The prosecution also emphasized Melody's calm demeanor during the investigation, which they argued showed her lack of remorse. The defense, led by Melody's attorney, 38-year-old James Adler, claimed that Melody had acted out of self-defense. Adler argued that Melody had confronted Janet in a heated argument, and in the heat of the moment, Janet had attacked her first. However, the defense's argument was weak, and the jury found it hard to believe that Melody had acted in self-defense. Emotions ran high in the courtroom as Janet's family listened to the details of the case. They were devastated by the loss of a woman they had once admired. They had no idea about Janet's dark side, and hearing about her illegal activities and her death at the hands of someone they had once trusted was a cruel shock. After several weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 2 days before returning a guilty verdict. Melody was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The victim's family was relieved to see justice served, though they were still haunted by the betrayal and the shocking events that led to Janet's death. After the trial, life in Diamond Springs slowly began to return to normal, but the effects of the murder lingered. Melody Berg's conviction left the town in shock. Many of the residents couldn't believe that someone so involved in the community could be capable of such brutality. Melody's family, once proud of her accomplishments, distanced themselves from her, and she was shunned by those who had once supported her. Victor Hughes, on the other hand, faced his own difficult journey. His life had been upended by the murder of his wife, Janet, and the revelation of her dark secrets. Though he was not involved in the crime, Victor was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Some people in town began to question how much he knew about Janet's activities, though there was no evidence to suggest he was involved. Chi Bunghong, the retired Malaysian businessman, returned to Malaysia after the investigation concluded. His role in Janet's illegal operation was never fully explored in the trial, but his involvement in the child trafficking scheme continued to haunt those who had learned about it. Janet's family struggled with the aftermath of her death. They had never suspected the true nature of her work or the lies she had told them. While they were relieved that justice had been served, the pain of losing someone they had loved and admired was still raw. As for the children at Hope Haven, the community worked to ensure their safety and well-being. The nonprofit organization had to rebuild its reputation and re-establish trust. It would take years for the wounds caused by Janet's death to heal, but over time, the people of Diamond Springs began to move on, though they would never forget the shocking events that had unfolded in their town. Diamond Springs will never forget the tragedy of Janet Hughes, a woman revered for her charity but undone by her secrets. This has been True Crime Case Files. Join us next time as we uncover more stories where truth proves stranger than fiction.